Vaters, everybody.
Thank you so much, Al. I'm going to hold this because otherwise it may be hard to hear in the back. In the back, you hear me? Everything clear? Not too loud in the front, I hope? Okay, we're good. Thank you. We're going to be somewhat in the dark here because when we turn the lights on so you could see me, you couldn't see the notes, and the notes are more important than me. So if you can hear me and see the notes, that's better than hearing me and seeing me. I think that's the way that goes. All right. It is wonderful to be with you this evening. Shelley and I have been looking forward to this for quite some time. We're going to spend a lot of time together tonight and tomorrow, and I hope we will give you some great value for your congregation. So let me begin this talk the way I begin all of my talks, with this introduction. Hi, I'm Karl, and I'm a small church pastor. It's not that meeting. Although, to make the admission that I'm a small church pastor kind of feels similar to that, doesn't it? It's got that feel to it, which is intentional. I've been a small church pastor for over 30 years, but I didn't know I was a small church pastor until about 10 years ago. You see, I thought I was a big church pastor that just hadn't arrived yet. But any minute, right around the corner, it was going to come bursting through. But after 20 years or so of waiting for it to happen, things changed. So when I say I'm a small church pastor, let me give you a couple definitions because it does need some defining to understand what we are. And as Alice mentioned earlier, we will not be talking about small churches exclusively. We will be talking from a small church perspective, however. And so that's what I want to walk you through some of. So when I say small church, what do I mean by that? It's a term that changes, and in fact, in my first book, I defined small church in one way. In my second book, I defined small churches in a different way. I now define small churches in yet a third way, and 5 years from now, I'll have a better one. But right now, here's how I define small churches. There are two types of small churches. There's the church of 50, give or take 50. And there's a church of 150, give or take 50. And I know those are two very different types of churches because all my ministry life has been spent either pastoring a church of 50, give or take, or 150, give or take. Those are two very, very different types of churches. I'm aware of that. So if you're doing the math and you're just going, wait a minute, 150, give or take 50, that means 200, and you're in a church of 20, and you think, wait a minute, 200 and 20 are the same thing? 200 is bigger than the biggest church in my town. I get it. But the reason they're all considered small is because the way a church of 20 is pastored and the way a church of 200 is pastored have far more similarities than differences. And a church of 200 is pastored actually very differently than a church of 500. Because once you get above 200 or so, everything changes for one simple reason. You can't know and serve everybody anymore. We just reach the limits of human capacity for our memory and for our availability, and so things have to shift. And understandably so, they should shift at that point. So I predominantly, but I do recognize that there are big differences between the church of 50, give or take, and the church of 150, give or take. But everything we'll be talking about this weekend will be coming really from the perspective of that. Secondly, when I say I'm a small church pastor, what do I mean? Well, I have been the lead pastor of 3 different churches in my ministry. As Alice mentioned earlier, I was born and raised in Canada, but I spent all of my adult years and all of my ministry years in California. Shelley and I have pastored 3 different churches. The first one was a tiny little chapel in the redwoods on the coast of California. And it was so deep into the redwoods, the biggest trees on earth, that if you drove into our church parking lot at noon on a sunny California day, your automatic headlights would go on. That's how deep into the woods it was. So it was a beautiful little church way tucked into the woods. We spent 4 great years there. We then went to another church on the North Bay of California, just north of San Francisco, and spent the 20 longest months of our lives there. It was a very, very difficult church. This is almost 30 years ago, and it remains a difficult church today because we still have friends there who tell us, yeah, it still hasn't changed. And when we left there, we weren't sure if we were still called to ministry or what was really going on because we were so bruised and beaten up by it. We then came to a congregation in Southern California and lived in a town called Fountain Valley, just 8 miles south of Disneyland, so a very heavily populated area, to a small building and the church had been through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. So they were really having leadership fatigue, and they weren't sure where they were. In fact, they had come really close to simply closing the church doors. But we came in as bruised and hurting pastor's family, and they were a bruised and hurting congregation. The facility is very small. If you come and sit in our church on a Sunday morning and you want to sit in the back row, there will only be 4 rows in front of you. It's a small facility, but it's on a really busy street. Like tens of thousands of people drive by the front door every day. Most of them don't know our church is there. Like when we change something, we've had people go, "Oh, when did that church get there?" We've been here for 60 years. You just didn't notice us driving by several times every day. But I thought, because it's a big population, because we're on a major street, we're going to get this thing growing and going really soon. When I came to the church, on a big Sunday it had 30 people. On a typical Sunday it had about a dozen people. Because they were hurting, because we were hurting, we didn't do all that much for the first few years, except for really, we had worship services and we had potluck fellowship dinners. We worshiped and we ate. And it wasn't intentional, it was simply, that was about all any of us had the emotional or spiritual capacity to do. We were exhausted and we were hurt, and so we tried to worship and we tried to fellowship. And in about 7 years, I remember it very distinctly, at the end of the day in the office, in the middle of the week, I sat in my car and I looked out at the building, and all of a sudden something struck me. I looked out at my windshield of my car and I went, "Ah, that's a healthy church. That's a healthy church. I'm looking at a healthy church." This is about the 7-year point, like I said. At that point, we were running around 75 people, just so you have a kind of a marker in your mind. But it wasn't about the numbers, it was just about health. I realized, okay, the church is healthy now. And because I was sitting in my car and looking out over the windshield, this image immediately popped into my head. I thought, I feel like I've been under the hood of this church for 7 years. I finally have the thing where it's healthy, and now I'm sitting in the driver's seat as the pastor, and I have no idea where to take the thing. How do you pastor a healthy church? I had no idea. I hadn't pastored one in 10 years, and they hadn't been one in 20 years. And so I actually took it to our church leadership and I said, "We have a healthy church." They were as surprised as me. And then I gave them my dilemma. I said, "What do we do now?" And they went, "I don't know, maybe share the health with others." And, "Oh, that's a good idea." So instead of just simply keeping everything inward, we started to reach outward. We started going out into the community, letting people know we were there and doing new things. And over the next few years, the church grew, and at about 15, 16-year point, we were running almost 200 people. And at that point, we were overwhelming our tiny sanctuary in 2 services a day, and more than overwhelming our even smaller parking lot. And so I looked around and I found the local junior high school, and they allowed me on Sunday mornings to rent their Kappa Gymnatorial Librarium. You know that room that every junior high school in America seems to have, that big one that serves everything? And it was about the size of this room, maybe a little bit bigger, which is substantially big for us. And so every Sunday morning, a faithful crew of people tore down our audio equipment and a whole bunch of other things and brought it all over. We worshiped in that sanctuary. We set up kids' rooms in classrooms, and for about a year we worshiped there. And in the next about 2 years we worshiped there. And in the next 2 years, we grew from 200 on a Sunday morning to averaging 400 on a Sunday morning. In fact, it was only about 20 months. We grew from 200 to 400. And then I went to the board and I said, "Okay, we're tired. Me and the staff, mostly volunteer staff, we're exhausted going from 200 to 400. We need to hire staff for a church of 600 because that's where we'll be in a couple of years." They saw the chart and they said, "Yeah, let's do that." So we hired staffing for a church of 600. And then after a couple of months, everything went into reverse. In just under 2 years, we went from 200 to 400. And then in less than a year, we went from 400 down to, actually, I can't tell you how small we got, because it's fun to count when you're growing. But when you're dropping that fast, it was like, "Don't give me the numbers anymore. I know everybody's name." The good news was we fit back in our little chapel just fine. Every Sunday we were under 100. Many Sundays we were under 50. Less than a year before that, we'd been 400, and there had been no scandal and there had been no split. And I was left reeling. I didn't know what was going on. And so I left. I left for 40 days. The only reason I left for 40 days is because I couldn't find an 80 in the Bible. I actually did it. I actually looked through scriptures to see somebody in the Bible had to have taken an 80 or 100-day retreat. Just so you know, it's all 40s. Everybody is all 40s. And I left for 40 days and did not know if I would come back to the church or come back into ministry again. And during that time, I went and I talked to a Christian counselor. And I walked through my frustration, and I told him I'm angry at the church, I'm angry at myself, I'm angry at God. I don't know what happened. I did everything right, and the thing collapsed beneath my feet. And he looked at me and he said something that changed my life. He said, Karl, you have to figure out how to define success in ministry without numbers attached to it. And I had no idea what that meant. In fact, I looked at him and said, I don't even know what that means. He says, I don't know what that means either, but we have to figure that out together because chasing the numbers is killing you. And it sounds like it's killing a pretty good church. And he was right. And that point on, I started really delving into what does it look like to become a healthy church. So we'll get more into that story tomorrow, but I just wanted to introduce myself to you so you know who I am and where I'm coming. And the reason for that is simply this. We'll illustrate it in this Venn diagram here. Actually, we're going to look at what's working in churches that are thriving. We're going to talk these 2 sessions tonight about some of the things we've been facing in the last year and a half and how we can face them in a healthy way. But here's why I give you my story to start out, because most of the time when we come to sessions, we come and we hear big church pastors speaking to others from a big church standpoint. And there are wonderful things that big church pastors can teach all of us. But if you're in a small church, represented by the circle on the right, the smaller your church is, the less overlap there is between your church and big churches. The bigger your church is, the more overlap there is between your church and big churches. So in a lot of conferences that I went to during that season, and we'll talk about some of that tomorrow morning, I felt left out, or I felt like I'm going to try it and it didn't work, and I thought there was something wrong with me. And I found out that what was wrong, and it wasn't wrong, was that when you're hearing from people on the left circle and you live in the right circle, some of what they say applies to you because there is some overlap, but a whole bunch of what they say simply doesn't apply in the small church context. They're not wrong. They're just in a different circle. I wasn't wrong. I was just in a different circle from them, but nobody told me that. So we'll get into some of that in a little more detail tomorrow, but tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the last 18 months and some of that because that's more urgent in some of our hearts. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to shift the arrow, and we're going to be talking from a small church standpoint. So everything I say today and tomorrow will apply and will be helpful to anybody in any church of any size, whether you're a pastor or a lay leader or you're a church volunteer. It will all apply to everybody, but I just want you to know the perspective that it's coming from. It's coming from a small church perspective. And not just my perspective, because after starting this ministry, writing my book 9 years ago, I've now spent the last 9 years doing sessions like this and talking to hundreds, at this point thousands of other small church leaders. And so I'm gaining from their wisdom as well and bringing that together and able to give it to you. So that's just gives you an idea of the perspective that we'll be coming from today and tomorrow. Now, everything that I'm going to be talking about for the next these 6 sessions together, I put together a page on my website with all of the notes. So if you have a QR code, QR codes came in and all of a sudden everybody thought we all should know how to do it automatically, and nobody taught me how. So if you know how to use a QR code, you can scan that, or you can see my wife, Shelly. Shelly, wave your hand. There she is over there. Shelly. There she is over there. That's my wife over there. So she will get you a QR code later if you can't scan it from there. Or you can just go straight to it, karlvaters.com/SWMO21. Oh, I put 2021 up there. That's a mistake. It should just be 21. No 2021, just 21. So SWMO21 will get you to the page with all of the notes for all of these sessions. And I'll put that on the bottom of each of the slides that are coming up, and I hope I did it right on the bottom of the slides. I did. It's correct there, SWMO21. But it's too small for you to read, so it doesn't matter if it's correct. But that's what it is. So SWMO21, karlvaters.com/that, and that will be where all of the notes are. And the nice advantage of putting my notes online is about a third of the bullet points in the notes will have a clickable link that you can click on, and you can go to an article that I wrote or an article of someone else that I might reference, so you can get further information about it. So a couple times I'll reference an article elsewhere, and then you can actually go and you can confirm it. So I'm going to self-Google for you. So it'll all be there, and you can find it whenever you want to. So let's talk about what's been happening in the last 18 months, and especially in this session, what's working in churches that are thriving during this season. And again, this is because I've had this opportunity to be speaking to small churches for the last several years, and now for the last 18 months I have talked to hundreds and hundreds of small church pastors by Zoom. I've had more pastors crying on my computer in the last year and a half than I ever want to see again. It's been a challenging season. And I've talked to a lot of folks, and I've heard from both the positives and the negatives, and so we're going to filter some of that for you. First of all, oh yeah, there we go, back again. Right now, people are spending most of their time in two extreme places, and they are on one side isolated, and on the other side engaged in mass and social media. For years, this was voluntary. And then all of a sudden, it became involuntary. All of a sudden, we couldn't go out, and the only way we connected with the outside world was through social media. And so we went there involuntarily. So what happened was you had some folks who loved it and were doing it voluntarily, who then had to go involuntarily, and now they're like bears in a cave, and they never want to leave hibernation. And you've got others who can't wait to get out. They're driving themselves and others crazy, wanting to get out. If you are living your entire life in these two extremes, in isolation on one side and engaged in mass and social media on the other side, if that is where you are spending virtually all of your life, this is a very unhealthy place to live. And this is where a large majority of people are spending themselves. Not just younger people, but older folks as well, spending too much of their time isolated and alone, but on mass and social media. And what social media especially does is it gives us the illusion of connection. It gives us the illusion that we're not isolated, but we are. Alone in our house on Facebook is not true community. Now, there is some connection that can be gained there. Bill and I met on social media, and we actually had the chance to meet face-to-face and have lunch today, okay? So that it can be helpful. I'm not against it. There's some value there. But when all of your time is spent in those two extreme places, it's really unhealthy. So what's the solution? The solution is simply this. We need the middle ground of community. We need the middle ground of community. And I've got really good news for you. There's no better place to get the community that we need than in a healthy church. We can help people meet their emotional needs, their spiritual needs, their social needs, their relational needs. Virtually every need of human beings is dealt with in a healthy church. And so we have an opportunity right now to step into that gap. Some people who are dying to come back. Others who are staying isolated. Many of you know that because you're in congregations that are now open again and people are coming back, but you're only seeing half, maybe 2/3, maybe less than half of your congregation after actually coming back. Why? I was talking about this earlier with somebody. It's from Newton's laws of motion, and I think it's his third law of motion that says an object at rest stays at rest, and an object at motion stays at motion until acted upon by an outside force. So what's happened in a lot of our churches is a lot of our people were going to church out of habit, out of culture, out of a generational thing that they just did. So the object at motion, the motion of going to church just continued because it wasn't acted upon by an outside force. So they were just going to continue to go to church. Now it was acted upon by the outside force of the pandemic lockdowns. Now they're an object at rest, and they're going to stay at rest until acted upon by an equally strong outside force that brings them back in again. Whether it's the longing of our heart, or a reconnection with people who love them, who reach out to them, or whatever that outside, or just simply the desire to connect again because they're feeling lonely. But a lot of folks, once they get at rest and they look around and they realize, oh, I was just doing that out of habit. I was just doing that because I'd always done it. And now I don't miss it, and I'm fine, and I'm going to stay here. And so we're going to have to try to help people overcome that and help them recognize, just simply for the sake of their own emotional, spiritual, and relational health, they need to get out of their rooms, and the best place for them to be is in a healthy church environment. So we need the middle ground of community. Now, in order to start moving towards that, there are two keys to recovery after the pandemic. And I keep talking about after the pandemic, and I never know when that after is going to come. I thought we'd be done there by now. We thought we'd be there 6 months ago. I'm pretty sure we'll be there 6 months from now, but I'm not sure we'll be there 6 months or 6 years from now. Whenever this happens, I believe there's going to be two keys to recovery that we need to begin to think right now. Key number one is this. Don't try to go back to what was. I'm talking to way too many pastors and church leaders, and everything is about how do we get everybody back? How do we get the programs back? How do we get things back to the way they were? We're all longing for the good old days of 2019. Our window for nostalgia has gotten really short recently. Right? Good old days used to be childhood, and now it's 2 years ago. You can't do that. There's a reason why our cars have a rear view mirror that's 8 inches wide and a windshield that is 6 feet wide. There's a reason for that. That's about the percentage that we should spend our lives looking forward and looking backward. Do we need the rear view mirror? Absolutely. We should appreciate where we've been. We should glance back occasionally. It gives us perspective. It helps us know where we're going. The past matters. We should glance back at it, but it should always be with an eye to the future. We're looking to go ahead. And too many of us right now are driving our churches by the rear view mirror. And if you do that, you're going to hit something. You're going to crash and burn. You can't drive the church forward looking in the rear view mirror. We can't look to go back to what was. So, what do we do instead? We have to build on what we're learning. Build on what we're learning. My dad taught me this when I was a teenager. We lived in Modesto, California, in the middle of the Central Valley of California. How many of you my age and older, you remember the old western Big Valley? Yeah. Big Valley was Central California where I lived. It's this huge valley. It's one of the largest agricultural land in the world. Everybody thinks California is just Hollywood, but in fact, no. The Central Valley of California is one of the biggest agricultural places in the world. Almonds and grapes and oranges and peaches, you name the fruit or vegetable or nut, and it's grown there. And that's where I grew up in Modesto, California, right in the middle of all of that, right in the middle of wine country. And so one of my first jobs, I got a job at a peach processing plant. And I showed up, I was working the night shift because I was a college student during the day. So I showed up at the peach plant in the evening, and the first thing they do with the new recruits is they put them on the conveyor belt where the peaches are going by, and all you got to do is pick out the peaches where the pit has not been taken out. So it's after the pitter. They cut them in half, they pull the pit out. Some of them, they miss the pit, and so as you're going by, you're just looking for pits in the peaches. You pull it out, you lay it off to the side, and somebody else takes the peaches out. So it was just doing this, grabbing. Sometimes you'd look for several minutes and nothing, and then you'd see one with the pit. I felt like Lucy and Ethel, except that I didn't put any of them in my mouth. And we did that for a while. Now, what nobody told me was that for the first little while when you're on a conveyor belt, the conveyor belt is moving. After the first couple hours, the conveyor belt isn't moving anymore, you are. It is really challenging. All of a sudden, you start getting dizzy and you think you're moving, but you're not. It's really, really strange. And what they were doing was they'd put the new kid on that and then they'd watch, because this was apparently entertaining to the old timers. And they watched me at about the 2 or 2.5 hour point, and I was about to go over, and I was a big boy too, so they were like, we can't have him crash, he'll hurt himself and others. So they finally came over and they pulled me off and they said, okay, go take a breath. And I had to sit down for a bit and get a breath. And they said, okay, we'll put you somewhere else. And what they did was they put me at the end of the conveyor belt where all the peaches went in, and I had to go through and I had to pick out the rotten ones now. Yeah. So I got home from the first day. My dad sees me the next day. He goes, how did it go first day on the job? I said, it is horrible and I hate it. He said, okay, but what did you learn? I said, I learned that it's horrible and I hate it. He said, okay, you learned something. That's good. That was it. He was fine. Next night, did the same thing. They put me somewhere else. I got dizzy again. Next day, my dad goes, how'd it go? It's horrible and I hate it. He said, well, what did you learn? I said, it's horrible and I hate it. What else did you learn? Thought for a moment and went, I learned that I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. He said, okay, you learned something. Next day, same thing. What'd you learn? Horrible and I hate it. What'd you learn? Don't want to do that for the rest of my life. And what else did you learn? I guess I need to stay in college so that I can figure out how to do something other than this for the rest of my life. Yeah, good idea. And every day it was, what did you learn? And every day it was just one tiny little thing. And so he wasn't forcing it on me. He was just asking me, what are you learning from the tough experiences of life? And my dad's, he just lived by that idea. He says, I'm not going to go into a thing and just sit there and be miserable all day. If it is a difficult situation, I'm going to take something from it. So I look back at the pandemic, the 18 months we've been through, and who knows what else we have to go through. And it's been challenging. We've lost people. Just last week, we had funerals for 2 good friends who died of COVID just that recently. It's been hard. It's been difficult. But you know, I've got a friend named Dave Jacobs who says, if you go through pain and you don't learn anything from it, then the only thing you have is pain. And I refuse to go through this and only come out with the pain. I refuse to let the lockdowns and the pandemic win. I am going to take something out of it. I am going to force something out of this time. I am going to learn every single thing I can. I am going to suck the marrow out of this difficult time. There is much to learn now, but we have to get into that mindset. We have to ask ourselves, yes, this is difficult, but what am I learning from this? And when we learn something from it, then we have something to move forward with. We have to build on what we're learning. It's a challenging time. It's a difficult time. Absolutely. I am convinced that nothing has changed during pandemic. What pandemic did was it amplified and accelerated changes or stuckness that was already in place. Whatever was there, it's bigger and it's faster now. It really hasn't changed all that much. So we've got to build on what we're learning. So how do we start to build on what we're learning? Let me walk you through a couple principles. First of all, we need to respond contextually. It's been very popular in recent years for church leaders to say that your church needs to be relevant. And for a little while, I used the term, and I don't use it anymore, and here's why. The word relevant has too much baggage. Speaking from a small church perspective, if a church leader gets up and tells a bunch of small church leaders, your church needs to be more relevant, what they mean is that we need to understand our community and we need to respond to the needs of the community. That's what they mean, I think. But that's not what the typical small church pastor hears. By the time I say your church needs to be more relevant, and it passes out of my mouth, through the air, into your ears, and through your brain, you know how it lands in the brain of the typical small church pastor? You say you need to be relevant. We hear your church needs to be cool. That's what we hear. That may not be what's intended by relevant, but that's what we hear. Your church needs to be cool. Your church needs to be like all the cool stuff this church did, or that church did, or our church did. So I don't use the word relevant anymore. I use this. We need to respond contextually. What is your context, and how are you responding within your context? Because that's really what we're talking about more than anything else. You see, we don't need more cool churches. If you pastor or lead your church in a community where people have torn jeans, not as a fashion statement, but because they got it caught on the machinery last night, you are not pastoring a cool community. You're pastoring a blue-collar community. You're pastoring a hard-working community. You're pastoring a salt-of-the-earth community. You're pastoring a wonderful community. It just doesn't happen to be cool. And that's okay. We don't need more cool churches. We need to know our context and respond appropriately within the context. I was in a leadership forum a few years ago, and it was with all rural church leaders. And the first thing they did was to try to help us. Let's define rural. And by the way, every time I say rural, I feel like Scooby-Doo. Rural. It's a weird word. I know you didn't need to hear that, but I needed to say it. So the first thing they asked was, and everybody came up with their definition of rural, and then it started getting funny. And my favorite one of the day was this. You know you're in a rural community when there's no Starbucks, but there might be a Subway in the gas station. I love that. That's a good definition of rural right there. So you have to look at your context. If you're in a big city, you're going to minister in a different way than you are in a small town, than you will in an agricultural community, than you will in the downtown, than you will in a suburb. It's going to be different. And you're not going to learn as much from pastors who pastor in a suburb as you will other pastors who pastor in a community that's similar to yours if you're not in a suburb. So what's your context and how are you responding to that? And here's the deal. Your context has changed 10 years worth in the last 18 months. Easily 10 years worth in the last 18 months. So we need to go into our communities like a missionary goes into a foreign country. An intelligent missionary does not go into a foreign country and say, hey, by the way, teach all of them English first so I can talk to them when I get there. No, what do? We learn the language, we understand the culture, because in addition to knowing the language, when I go in, I don't want to use the correct language, but use a cultural illustration that in America is helpful, but there is seen as an insult. Their culture isn't wrong, it's just a different culture than they have different figures of speech, they look at things in different ways. And the culture around our congregations are the same thing. The language has changed, the way people perceive things has changed, and too often we get ourselves stuck in our ecclesiastical bubble and we don't recognize how the community around us is different. So what is your context? What is the context you're trying to minister in? How has it changed, especially in the last 18 months? Because it's changed a decade's worth in the last 18 months alone. And now let's respond to the needs within the context that we find ourselves. So that's the first thing we need to do is respond contextually. Secondly, we need to minister personally. Minister personally. When the pandemic first happened, I remember on the Sunday, I actually did a little thing on stage and said, they say there's this thing going around called coronavirus. At that point, we didn't even know what to call it, right? Corona, COVID-19, what do these things mean? And I actually did a little demonstration on stage, and I said, what we need to do, instead of shaking hands and hugging today when you see somebody, here's what you need to do. And I brought somebody up on stage, and I said, you need to do a high five, you need to do an air high five and an air hug. And on stage, we demonstrated 5 feet apart, an air hug and an air high five. And that was about how seriously we took it, right? And then on Wednesday, the governor got up and said, everything's closed. Bars are closed, theaters are closed, churches are closed, restaurants are closed, gyms are closed, schools are closed, everything is closed. And on Wednesday to Sunday, we had to figure out how to do church on Sunday when nobody could come in the building. And up until that point, we had not been live streaming. We'd been thinking about it, but it didn't seem all that urgent. All of a sudden, it was urgent. And somehow between Wednesday and Sunday, we had to figure out how to get it done. And we did. We had a great group of people who figured out how to do that. And then we thought we were only going to do it for a few weeks. And then when we realized, wait a minute, this isn't just going to be a few weeks, this could be months, it could be even longer than that. All of a sudden we realized we have to reconfigure how we're doing things. And what we did was we actually sat down with our leadership and we said, okay, this is the definition of failure for us. When all of this is over and everybody's back into the church again, if anybody who is a regular part of this church can tell us, nobody called me during the entire time of the lockdown, that is the definition of failure for us. We are determined that nobody will be able to say that when this thing is over. And so, you know what we discovered? We discovered there's a phone on this thing. Did you know that? I was shocked. There's still a phone on these things. So we put people on their phones. In fact, we got a hold of the young people first because they were climbing the walls for something to do. And we put them on the phone tree, and they were thrilled to be able to talk to somebody. And we had them calling seniors. And we told them, if you have to go to the store to pick up, because at that time, the only thing you could do was go to the store and come back again. If you're going to the store, here's your assigned senior member of the congregation or a couple senior members of the congregation. Before you go, you call them and you say, what can I pick up for you when you bring it over for them? And they stepped up and they started doing that for themselves, for each other. And we ministered personally. Yep. At first, we had to get technical. We had to figure out how to get online. We had to figure out how we could be heard and seen on the computer. We had to figure out where we were going to put our recorded service when we did it. But then once we got it, if you're at the point where that's where that is and you've got the technical stuff done, don't worry about it anymore. Because by the time this is all done, 5, 10 years from now, when people look back to this time, they will not remember how well you framed your live stream shot. They will remember whether or not the pastor or a friend from the church called them. And they will remember if you didn't. Now, I know a lot of us are worried that we've got congregations where only a third, a half, 2/3 maybe at the most are coming back. Continue to pastor the people even if they aren't coming back to the building. It's an object at rest, and maybe the outside force that they need to make them an object in motion again is regular contact with somebody who loves them and cares for them, and without agenda just calls them to say, how you doing? We miss you. We love you. No guilt attached. Just, I'm here for you. If anything I can do for you, continue to bless them, continue to love them. That's going to be the only way to bring them back. Minister personally. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow as well. Thirdly, we need to prepare continually. I have a piece of bad news for you. 4 words. This will happen again. Maybe not a pandemic, but we live in a broken world where bad things happen. A tornado's coming, or an earthquake, or a flood, or a fire, or a drought, or the biggest business in town will close. It's not a matter of if something bad is coming, but when. because we live in a broken world where bad things happen. So we need to prepare continually. We can't do anything to go back in time and prepare for what we've just experienced and what we're still going through, but we can prepare for whatever might come next. And this is one of the big lessons we need to take from this. If we weren't prepared for it, how do we prepare for the next one? If we were prepared somewhat but not fully, how do we prepare better for the next time? If we were prepared well, how do we build on that to prepare even better for whatever the next difficult season might be? Because as difficult as this season is and remains for most of us, even when things do settle in again and this is gone, another difficult season will come. We know that because we look around and we see the world. We also know it because Jesus promised it. In this world you will have tribulation. I'm thankful that that's not where the sentence ends, but that is where the sentence begins. Well, we get some people who only live the front half of that sentence. Oh, in this world you'll have tribulation, and that's where they end their entire emotional process. And there are other people who only look at the last half. Be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world, and they forget the front half. And they just walk around like everything's awesome all the time. Jesus put those two things together in the same sentence. In this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. So let's prepare for the tribulation, the difficulty, the trying time, because we live in a broken world where bad things happen. But how can we begin to prepare for that? So let's take a look at it. I want to look at 4 very significant things that I noticed that churches who are responding and thriving well during this pandemic have. The first one is this: resources in reserve. Within days, certainly within weeks of the lockdowns, I started hearing from a lot of small church pastors, and several of them were in such difficult places, financially and in other ways, that with 2 or 3 Sundays locked out of their buildings and unable to take an offering and unable to raise the finances, they had to close their churches for good. They were already on a 2nd or 3rd mortgage. They were already in difficult situations. They had nothing in reserve. In addition to that, we had pastors who were running on 100 to 110%, and once the pandemic hit, it overwhelmed all their circuits and they couldn't take it anymore and they were done. But on the other hand, there were churches that had resources in reserve. They'd figured out how to live well within their margins. From the pastors and church leaders taking regular Sabbaths and regular vacations and regular times away to replenish, so that they had margin in their life, so that when a difficult season came in, they had the energy to be able to step it up. They weren't running at 100%. They were running at 75, 80%, and they had some margin that they could add during a difficult season. But also some really practical things about resources in reserve, like finances. Here's an example. In my congregation, for the first 15 years or so, like most small congregations, we were running, our finances were pretty much month to month and occasionally week to week. Yeah, we had the occasional Sunday where if we don't get X amount, I don't know how we're paying salaries this week. I don't know which bill we're going to pay. We had that, far too often. And at about 15 years, I looked to our church leadership and I said, 1, I'm tired of this, and 2, I feel like I'm not being a good steward of the finances that God is giving this congregation by living so close to the edge all the time. So I said, here's what I want to do. I want us to plan to start putting money away into a reserve. So I want to add a line item to our budget. And into that line item every month, I want to put 10% of all of the funds that are given that don't have any designation to them. So we won't touch the missions money or anything designated for anything else. But general money that comes into the general fund, we're going to put 10% of it into this account. And we're going to keep putting into it until we have 3 months of cash in reserve in the bank that we can draw on when we need it in an emergency situation. And I calculated that out, and if you do put 10% away, that takes you 2.5 years to put away 3 months worth of budget. So I said, I'll give us 3 years. In 3 years, we'll have that done. It took us 10 years. It took us 10 years. Why? Well, we were already tight, and so some months we didn't have the 10%. Other months we had maybe 12, but then the following month, the water heater broke. Right, so it was up and down, back and forth, but I was relentless, I was stubborn, we're going to keep doing this, and it took a decade to put 3 months worth of cash in the bank, but that happened about 5 years ago. So when the pandemic hit 18 months ago, And on a Wednesday, we realized by Sunday, we have to have a whole new technical expertise here. We have to go out, we have to buy cameras, we have to buy editing equipment, we have to buy cables, we have to buy microphones. We have to spend several $1,000s just to be able to do something that resembles church online on Sunday. And we can't go to the congregation for an offering because we can't bring them in here, which is why we have to do this. We didn't panic, we had the money. We went, we did it, we put it together. When during last summer we went for 4 months, we still couldn't meet in the building, and we could meet outside. So we had outdoor services on our patio. We had to buy the shade covers. We had to buy about half of our audio equipment because half of it couldn't be unplugged and brought outside. So we had another big expenditure. Again, that's what that's there for. We went into it. Thank the Lord and thank our congregation. They saw that need, and later they actually replenished it. We've already resupplied the whole thing, which we're really grateful for. But if we had been already tight to the edge, we would not have been able to do it. We would not have been able to respond. So we need to be better stewards of our resources, both the resources of ourselves, the time that we're putting in. We need to give ourselves emotional and spiritual and time margins. And we need to make sure that we have resources in reserve. I believe this is good stewardship. The churches that had resources in reserve did much, much better during pandemic than those that were already on the edge and just couldn't take the extra burden. So we need to start putting resources in reserve for the next time a challenge happens. The second type of churches that responded and thrived well during the pandemic have team-based leadership. Team-based leadership. Again, during this pandemic, so many things happened that none of us ever expected. And some of the calls that I got and emails that I got early on, this actually happened twice. 2 pastors who called me and said, "Karl, I don't know what to do. I've got people volunteering in my church to help out who have never volunteered before. And I don't know what to tell them to do because I do everything." Now, I get the I do everything pastor. I was an I do everything pastor for a lot of years. Well, Shelley and I, we did everything for a lot of years. And it was wrong. It wasn't good pastoring. It was codependency. And the Lord helped us to break that and to understand that scripturally even, again, which we'll talk about a little bit more tomorrow, even scripturally, what I call the pastoral prime mandate in Ephesians 4, verses 9 and 10, the only place in the New Testament where the word pastor is mentioned, we're not mentioned alone. We're mentioned with 4 other leadership gifts, and we're given one assignment in that passage. The only time pastor is mentioned, we're supposed to share the load with 4 others, and we're given one assignment. And the assignment is not do the ministry for the church. The assignment is equip God's people to do the works of ministry. Here's the deal. If you do all the ministry for the church, they'll let you. There won't be anybody putting up a stop sign, a red flag, going, "Oh no, Pastor, stop working so hard for us, please." That will not happen. You will get all kinds of pats on the back. You will, right? Overwork is maybe the biggest bad habit that is supported in our culture today. So what we did was we had to shift to a team-based leadership model, which is a biblical model, which is making disciples who become disciple makers. And the congregations that had team-based leadership, when people volunteered who had never volunteered before, they had a team to put them on. And even before new people volunteered, immediately as soon as it hit, the pastor wasn't sitting there trying to figure out how to fix their iPhone so they could be seen on Sunday. Somebody else came in to show them how to do that because they had a team doing that. And this is not just a big church thing. This is a church of any size thing. We are all called to be making disciples who become disciple makers and put them together on teams to do ministry together so that when difficult things happen, we bear the burden together. It sits on multiple shoulders and not just on one person's shoulder. We need to work harder on that. Again, we'll get into that a little bit more tomorrow. So resources in reserve, team-based leadership. The third big difference between churches that survived and thrived or churches that are struggling is this one, adaptability. Adaptability. There's a group of people out there, and even some pastors, who have a picture in their mind that church is meeting in this building, at this time, on this day, in these pews, singing these songs, wearing these clothes, with this denominational tag on the sign, and they've got this whole list, and all of these things mean church, and if you change any of those, it's not church anymore. And here's the challenge. When pandemic hit and lockdown hit, all of a sudden we couldn't meet in that building on that day. on that time, sitting in those pews, singing those songs, wearing those clothes. We couldn't do that anymore. All of that stuff was taken away. And I think that's where some of the pushback came from, where I heard from, I still continue to hear from people complaining, I can't believe the governor closed down our churches. Oh no, stop. I live in California where we had way more lockdowns than in most places, and let me tell you, the governor of California did not close down a single church. He doesn't have that power. He told us we couldn't go into the building. And if you think that closes down the church, you got to check your theology, folks. I don't need a building to have church. We've never needed buildings to have church. Closing down my building does not close down my church. Don't give them that power. Don't even give them the sense that they might have that power, because if they think they might have it, they'll take more. So even if there is government overreach, they can't overreach into the church and close it down. They don't have the power. Jesus said, I will build my church, and Jesus tends to know what he's doing. It worked against Rome. I think we'll be okay against the American government. I think we'll be fine. I don't think, right? The church, in fact, has survived, and not just survived, but thrived, actually even better spiritually, mostly during difficult seasons more than during comfortable seasons. Adaptability, we have to, so churches that understood that our church is not about these physical things or these particular things. We have them, we appreciate them, we enjoy them, but we don't depend on them. They don't define us. Those churches that had already been adapting and knew how to make an adaptation to whatever their adaptation was, whether it was a musical change or whether it was changing the facility around so that it worked better, or whatever those adaptable things were, the churches that already knew how to adapt those extra biblical things when needed were able to make this adaptation recently much more easily. But those that were locked down and had the tighter your picture is, the more things you add to this must be in place to be church, the easier it is to close it down. But if we stick with really what Jesus said the church was, nothing can be changed and everything else is adaptable. So we need to understand that the churches that had been adaptable already were able to adapt to this quite readily. Those that were stuck in particular forms of worship and lost those forms of worship even for a season did struggle and continue to struggle. So we need to come out of this and learn better adaptability to that. And then the fourth one is this: unity. In my book, I actually wrote a book this time last year about the pandemic, thinking it was just about to be over, called The Church Recovery Guide. It's just a short book, one of the books that's over there later. And in it, I only put these first three things: resources and reserve, team-based leadership, and adaptability. And I didn't put number 4 in there. And the day I sent my manuscript into my publisher, the week that I sent my manuscript into my publisher was the week that George Floyd was killed. And everything that blew up after that blew up. And I almost got a hold of my publisher and pulled it back to respond to it. And I thought, you know what? The Lord knew when I was going to write it and hand it in. The Lord knew that this horrible thing was going to happen. And this may be his way of telling me that's not your thing to write about. So I let it be. But I do have the opportunity to talk about it. So we look at this and we see disunity in the church. I think, especially over the last 18 months, and especially over the last year or so, we have seen so much disunity. And maybe what makes this challenge different than most other challenges that we can read about through church history is, through most of church history, when difficult things happened around us, it brought the church together more strongly. It united us around a common mission. And we responded to the external threat by greater unity. This time feels different because in this time it is actually causing us to reflect the disunity in culture in the church rather than responding to it in unity. And what I've discovered in my conversations with a lot of other pastors is this: there are some pastors who have been shocked by the disunity in their church. And what several of them have reflected to me is this: I thought we were united, but it turns out we were just uniform. And uniformity is very different from unity. So I've asked some of them, what do you mean by uniform? And what they mean is, it turns out we really weren't united around mission. We were just united politically, or we were united ethnically, or we were united by a common tradition, or we were united by this particular physical church building. We thought we were together. We thought we were united, but the thing we were actually united around wasn't strong enough to maintain us during such a divisive season. The only thing strong enough to maintain us during a divisive season like this is unity around Christ and his mission. So in our congregation, we have people on every side of every issue. We got Democrats and Republicans, pro-vax, anti-vax, pro-mask, anti-mask. You name the issue, we have people on both sides of it in our congregation. And we have not had a whiff of a serious disagreement among any of them. We've had conversations, we've had healthy conversations, we've had animated conversations, we've had loud conversations. But nobody's gotten mad, nobody's gotten angry, nobody split the church over it, because at the end of the day, we look at it and go, but that's not as important as the mission. Let's stay on mission together, loving Jesus and loving others and moving forward. And so we need to stay united. Now, the challenge is, how do we help people stay united when everybody seems to be at each other's throats? And why is everybody so upset lately? So, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to come back to the next session, and we're going to talk about why is everybody so upset lately? And what we're actually going to talk about, let me give you a bit of a hint. We're going to talk about trauma. We're going to talk about I've actually got some help from a friend of mine who has studied neurobiology. She has a doctorate in education with an emphasis in neurobiology. And we're going to talk about healing from emotional and spiritual trauma from both a scriptural and a neurobiological standpoint to understand why everybody's so upset, where that's coming from, and how do we get to the other side of that. So, it is currently 7:50.